My mother placed her freshly manicured hand on my shoulder and pressed me down into a chair in the middle of the Carlyle's ballroom, while the entire room had its eyes on me. She spoke in a low, flat voice without any warmth. "Sit down. You are embarrassing this family in front of the Mercers. You have done enough. Let your sister have her day without you making it about yourself." Up on the $150,000 wedding stage, my sister was holding the microphone, radiant in an extravagant gown, accessorized with jewelry purchased with exactly $45,000 drained clean from my 5-year-old son's education fund. She looked straight at me and announced to 200 guests that I was a living proof of failure, so the rest of the family would never have to learn that hard lesson again. I sat still, my hand flat against the thin folder inside my bag, eyes on my mother, not looking away, not shedding a single tear. I had waited 5 years caring for her through hospital stays and exhausting overnight shifts to arrive at this one moment of truth. The second the groom stepped up and took the microphone out of her hand, the entire room went silent in front of a truth about a $200,000 inheritance that my mother believed she had tricked me into signing away just the night before. 10 seconds after that, the color drained from her face completely. The chamber music did not reach me. I could hear it technically. The strings somewhere above the conversation and the crystal and the polished shoes on marble. But what registered in my chest was something lower and steadier. A rhythm I had learned to track the way I tracked a patient's pulse in the first 60 seconds after arrival. I adjusted my posture on the silk-upholstered chair and did not look for approval or acknowledgement or explanation. She had already said what she had to say. I smoothed the front of my dress instead, one slow pass of the palm down the fabric, and I began to read the room. The grand ballroom of the Carlyle was dressed to suggest permanence, gold leaf on the moldings, crystal chandeliers throwing light in every direction, like a system designed to eliminate shadow. Round tables draped in white linen, each set with silver that had not been touched yet, each surrounded by people who had arrived assuming they understood the occasion. I did not look at the chandeliers. I located the service exits, counted the staff positions along the east wall, and measured the distance from my chair to the microphone stand on the raised platform at the front of the room. 18 steps, maybe 20. I had been running triage in loud spaces for 9 years, and I could map a room the way other people read a menu. My mother was at the head table. She had inclined toward the mother-in-law with the particular angle she used when she wanted to signal intimacy to an audience, and I watched her lift the embroidered silk handkerchief from her lap and press it lightly to the corner of her mouth. The gesture was smooth and practiced, the kind of thing a person develops over decades of performance. She did not look at me when she said it, which was itself a choice, because the distance between us was small enough that I heard every word with full clarity. She said it to the other woman, but she aimed it at me. That I had always preferred corners and silence, that I had a way of making myself a surplus presence even on the happiest days. I noted the word she chose, surplus. I filed it. My sister was standing near the platform. The Tiffany pieces caught light every time she moved, the necklace and the matching earrings and the bracelet, each one purchased 11 days ago at a cost I knew precisely because I had seen the receipt in a photograph on my mother's phone before she realized I was standing behind her. The set had been acquired using funds that did not belong to either of them. $45,000, withdrawn in a single transaction from an account opened in my son's name. My son was 5. He was sitting 3 chairs away from me right now, his feet not quite reaching the floor, eating a bread roll with both hands. I pulled my chair slightly closer to the table and set the folder on the white linen. It was pale yellow, with a slight curl at the right edge from being stored flat in my bag for the past 3 hours. I did not open it. I placed my phone on top of it, screen face down, and I moved both items together until they sat exactly parallel to the edge of the table. Then I put my hands flat on the surface, and I let the noise of 200 people continue around me without entering me. My mother circled the head table. She held a glass of red wine in her left hand, and she moved with the ease of a person who had decided, some time ago, that every room she entered was a room she was meant to inhabit. She stopped behind my chair. She did not bend to meet my eye level. She placed one gloved hand on my shoulder and let the weight of it rest there. Not heavy, just present. The way you would rest a hand on something you believed you owned. She told me, in a voice pitched just above the ambient sound, that I should listen carefully to what my sister was about to say, that it would clarify exactly where I belonged in this family. Then she pressed her thumbnail into the bone of my shoulder, one short, precise pressure, and she walked toward the front of the room. I counted. 1, 2, 3. I did not adjust my expression. I moved my right hand to the edge of the folder and let my index finger rest against the curled corner of the top page without pressing it flat. Under the table, my son's foot swung and made contact with my ankle, a small rhythmic bump that I felt travel up through the bone. My sister stepped onto the platform. The feedback from the microphone produced a brief, sharp tone that cut through every conversation in the room simultaneously, and for 1 second, the ballroom went completely silent in the way rooms do when a sound reminds everyone they are in a shared space. She touched the microphone with 2 fingers to steady it, then tipped her head to one side so that the earrings swung free and caught the spotlight. She was already smiling. I had seen that smile in various versions for 30 years, the one that appeared when she had calculated that the room was hers. She unfolded a small piece of paper with neat creases and smoothed it against the lectern, and I recognized the paper even from across the room because I had seen it on my mother's desk 4 days ago, covered in ink corrections in my mother's handwriting. She cleared her throat once, looked directly at me across 200 people, and opened her mouth to say the word my mother had chosen for her. She had rehearsed it. I could tell from the way she breathed before she spoke, a slow pull through the nose that she probably thought looked like composure but read, to anyone trained to watch bodies under stress, as the respiratory pattern of someone performing rather than feeling. The spotlight made the Tiffany pieces blaze. I kept my hands flat on the table and I watched. She told the room that I had always sacrificed in ways that exhausted other people. She phrased it warmly, with a small catch in her voice that she had probably practiced in front of a mirror, and several people at the surrounding tables nodded with the sympathetic automaticity of people who have been cued by tone rather than content. She said I had chosen to exist as a surplus presence so that my mother would have to endure me, and so that she could arrive at this clean and luminous day. She paused on the word clean and touched the pearl cluster at her throat as she said it. Then she smiled at the groom. He was watching the tablecloth. I noted the errors. This was something I had trained myself to do in difficult rooms, in the hours before a hard conversation, in the long periods of waiting that emergency medicine is mostly made of. I counted the mistakes they had made, the specific structural errors, the places where their plan had developed fissures they had not noticed because they had been too focused on what they were taking to pay attention to what they were leaving exposed. The first error was the assumption that I had signed the estate transfer document without reading it. I had been at the end of a 12-hour shift when my mother put it in front of me, and she had built her confidence on the belief that exhaustion made me careless. She was not wrong that I was tired. She was wrong about what tiredness does to me. It strips everything unnecessary. What remains is very clear. The second error was the assumption that the groom did not know about the personal debt my sister had accumulated and quietly transferred onto my mother's accounts to finance this wedding. I had the documentation for that as well. He was a family law attorney who had spent 8 years handling cases involving exactly this kind of financial arrangement, and I had not yet had a reason to tell him what I knew. The third error, the largest one, was my mother's belief that I would remain silent to protect the fiction of a functional family. I had maintained that silence for 5 years. She had understood the maintenance of it as a permanent condition. She had confused my patience with my surrender. My sister lowered her voice. She shifted from the note of warm condescension she had been using to something that suggested pity, and she began to reference my divorce. She looked at the groom as she did it, and then she looked at me, and her voice carried clearly through the room's sound system when she said that everyone should feel compassion for me, because I had chosen to exist as an unwanted burden on my mother for so many years. There was scattered, quickly muffled laughter from the direction of the in-laws' table, and my mother raised her handkerchief to the corner of her mouth. Her shoulders moved once with a suppressed reaction that she covered by turning to speak to the woman beside her. I pressed my fingertip against the curled edge of the folder. The paper was cool. Under the table, my son's foot bumped my ankle twice, stopped, then bumped again in a different rhythm. I watched the groom's hands. They were resting on the tablecloth with the fingers spread and the knuckles pale, and his eyes had moved from the tablecloth to a point somewhere between the platform and the floor. He had not looked at his wife in 4 minutes. I had been counting. My sister unfolded the second half of the paper. She was building towards something, and the architecture of her performance was clear enough that I could have written the final lines for her. My mother had drafted them. I had seen the handwriting. The word she had selected for the closing was the same word she had used in a different room, in a different year, in a fluorescent corridor at 2 in the morning when she believed that saying a thing with enough flatness made it become permanently true. The word came out of the speakers and fell through the air of the ballroom, and for 1 second I was not in the room anymore. The smell of antiseptic hit first, then the flicker of fluorescent light that had always needed replacing, and the sound of a cardiac monitor in the far room replaced the chamber music with something more accurate and older, and the folder under my fingers became a stack of hospital billing statements with edges sharp enough to cut. The hospital corridor materialized with the particular totality that certain memories have, the kind that do not arrive as images but as full sensory environments you are placed inside without warning. I was leaning against a wall with paint that had begun to peel at the baseboards, wearing the shoes I wore at the end of long shifts, the left sole separating slightly at the toe. The fluorescent tube above me had been cycling between full brightness and a faint brownish flicker for the entirety of a 12-hour shift. I had reported it 3 times. It had not been replaced. My mother was in the wheelchair the hospital required for discharge. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the ring on her right hand, a gold band she had been wearing for 31 years, and she was rotating it slowly between the fingers of her left hand with the patience of someone performing a familiar task. The stack of papers I was holding was significant enough that I had developed a specific way of gripping it, thumbs at the top, fingers spread across the back, because if I held it wrong, the edges of the individual sheets made small cuts in the web of skin between my fingers. The papers were billing statements. Not one. A progression of 7 months of charges from 3 different facilities, the ones she had asked me to manage because the system was difficult to navigate, and I worked inside it and she needed someone she could trust. I had trusted that trust. I had understood it as care requiring coordination, which I was trained to provide. I had been paying the portions insurance declined, supplementing with money from my own account and also from my son's education fund because she had presented a gap that she said was temporary, and I had believed the word temporary. She cleared her throat. The sound echoed off the walls in a way that sounds echo in corridors with no furniture to absorb them, and she said, without raising her eyes from the ring, that I should not look at her with that expression. She said the debts I had taken on were my obligation, not hers. She said I was the surplus of the household, the child the house could have managed without, and that this moment was simply the corrective period, the time in which I paid back what my existence had cost, so that my sister's future could be clean and unencumbered. The word clean again. She used it the same way each time, with the same flatness, as though it were a clinical designation. My sister was leaning in the doorway of a room at the end of the corridor. She was scrolling through something on her phone. She did not look up during the conversation. She did not look up when my mother finished speaking. She looked up only when my mother turned the wheelchair and began to move away from me, and then she looked up just long enough to exchange a look with my mother, and she smiled the same smile I had just watched her deploy at the ballroom lectern. A smile that was smooth and reflexive and entirely disconnected from the situation it was responding to. Then she looked back at her phone. I stood in the corridor for a time I did not measure. The billing papers were in my hands. The fluorescent light kept its irregular cycle. The monitor in the far room kept its steady rhythm. The word my mother had used entered a part of my memory that I do not experience as thought, but as structure. A change in the arrangement of things, permanent in the way that scar tissue is permanent, occupying the same space as the original, but functioning differently. The sound of crystal striking crystal pulled me back. A glass somewhere on the head table had been moved carelessly, and the tone it produced was sharp and bright, and entirely unlike anything in a hospital corridor, and the ballroom reassembled itself around me with the complete detail of an environment I had spent 3 hours studying. The white linen, the silver, the chandeliers throwing their diffuse, expensive light. My sister still on the platform, now lifting her champagne glass for what appeared to be a closing toast. I noted the fifth error. They had assumed the memory would break me again. They had used the same word in the same way my mother had used it 5 years ago, believing that repetition would produce the same result it had produced then, that I would absorb the word and the weight of the room and remain in my seat. I placed both palms flat on the table. I felt the full weight of my body distribute through my arms and into the surface. My pulse was 60 beats per minute. It had not varied in the past 40 minutes by more than 4 beats in either direction. I was ready to stand, and I knew exactly what I was going to say, and I had been prepared to say it since 11:47 the previous evening when I photographed the final page of the document my mother believed I had signed without reading. My sister raised her glass higher, and across the room, the groom's eyes moved from the tablecloth to the pale yellow folder resting under my right hand, and he went very still. The chair made a sound when I pushed it back. A low scrape on the carpet, not loud but distinct. The kind of sound that registers in a room only when a room is already paying attention. The scattered applause that had begun at one table stopped. The string quartet, which had been preparing to resume, did not. I placed my right hand on my son's shoulder for a moment, feeling the steadiness of his breathing through the fabric of his jacket, and then I turned to face the platform. I did not walk toward it quickly. I took the folder from the table, pressed my thumb into the curled corner of the top page to hold the stack level, and I moved out of the shadow of the marble column. I stopped in a position where I was visible from every table in the room and equidistant from the head table and the platform, and I did not look at the guests. I looked at my sister. She was still holding the champagne glass. The hand holding it had tightened at some point after she registered that I was standing, and the skin across her knuckles had gone from its usual color to a faint pink. She had not completed her sentence. The microphone was still live. I said she had been right about one thing. I said it clearly and without raising my voice above a normal conversational register, because the room was quiet enough that I did not need to. I said that for 5 years there had indeed been a surplus presence in this family. I said she had identified the presence correctly but had identified the direction incorrectly. I said that the surplus was not the person who had been paying every invoice, covering every copay, and managing every care coordination request. The surplus was the person who had used a 5-year-old child's education account to purchase the jewelry she was currently wearing at her own wedding. The champagne glass did not shatter. She simply stopped moving, and the suspended animation of that stillness was its own kind of information. Her eyes went to my mother and then back to me, the reflex of someone who has been operating with a supply line for so long that the first response to any new pressure is to locate the supply line. My mother had gone rigid in her chair. She was holding the handkerchief but had forgotten what she had been using it for. I took 2 steps toward the head table. My heels produced a clean, regular sound on the marble floor beyond the carpet's edge, and I stopped when I could see the groom's face clearly. He had a certain quality of stillness that I recognized from professional contexts, the kind of attention that legal training produces, the focused absence of expression that means someone is processing rather than performing. He looked at my sister's necklace. Then he looked at me. A single crease appeared between his eyebrows and did not leave. I set the folder on the table. I pressed my palm flat on top of it without opening it, and I let the silence do the next portion of the work. My mother moved first. She put the handkerchief down and placed both hands on the table to push herself up, and I raised the folder 3 inches off the surface, a single slow lift, and she stopped. The room was not silent the way rooms are silent when nothing is happening. It was silent the way rooms are silent when everyone has simultaneously decided to stop pretending that the thing in front of them is not the thing in front of them. I could hear the air conditioning. I could hear the sound of one guest setting down a fork against a plate somewhere in the back of the room. I counted inside my head. 1, 2, 3. I know this is the part where your pulse is up, because mine was down, which is what happens when you have been waiting for something for this long, and it finally arrives. If you have ever had to stand in a room and say a true thing when everyone in that room wanted you to be quiet, hit like on this one. You do not have to explain anything. Just that. And then, let me tell you what happened when I opened the first page of that folder and slid it across the table. The groom stood up from his chair, moved to the edge of the head table and looked at the edge of the page just visible under my palm. His breathing had changed. Behind him, across the room, the woman I knew as my mother's sister was already on her feet. My mother lunged across the corner of the table to reach the folder. She was wearing lace gloves, the kind she reserved for occasions she considered important, and the hand inside the glove was shaking visibly. I stepped back a half step, smooth and without hurry, maintaining the distance between her reach and the folder with the same automatic adjustment I use when a patient in distress makes a sudden movement toward monitoring equipment. The groom was standing between us now, not deliberately, but because he had been in the process of moving toward me when she moved toward the folder, and his body occupied the space. She told me that enough was enough. She said it through her teeth at a volume calibrated for 3 people, and the words carried in them the compressed history of 30 years of similar commands issued in similar tones, the particular frequency she had always used to signal that a conversation was ending on her terms. She said it was a wedding. She said I should think about what I was doing to my sister. I set the folder on the head table. I pushed a silver fork to one side with 2 fingers to create a flat surface, and I opened the cover. The sound the paper made when I turned the first page was small, a dry, precise sound, and it was the loudest thing in the room. I kept my hand flat on the open page to prevent the air conditioning from moving it. I did not look at my mother. I watched the groom's face as he read the line at the top of the first page. I had printed this document myself from the original file, and the typography was clean and uniform, easy to read at a slight distance. Account name, account number, account holder, date of transaction, amount, $45,000, withdrawn at 11:17 the previous night. He picked up the paper. He held it the way lawyers hold documents they are reading for evidentiary purpose, not loosely but with a grip that communicates that the document is now in a different category from the surrounding objects. He looked at the withdrawal date. He looked at the authorization signature. His jaw moved once and then stopped, and the crease between his eyebrows deepened from a single line into 2. My sister had come down from the platform. She was standing at my mother's left elbow and she was crying, or producing the physical signals of crying. Shoulders moving, one hand pressed below her collarbone, the other reaching toward the groom's arm. She told him not to listen to me. She said I was doing what I had always done, which was to find the worst possible moment and insert myself into it out of jealousy. The groom's arm did not move toward her reaching hand. I removed a second page from the folder. It was a receipt. The header showed the name of the jewelry store. The date on it was 11 days ago. The amount matched the total value of the 3 Tiffany pieces my sister was currently wearing, and the payment method showed a transfer from an account with the same number I had just shown on the bank statement. I placed this page directly on top of the bank statement, aligning the edges so that both dates were visible simultaneously. My mother put her hand to her chest. I watched her do it. I watched the placement of the hand, the angle of the fingers, the way her breathing changed to accommodate the performance, and I noted the things that were absent. The skin around her mouth was not losing color. Her lips were not cyanotic. Her brow was not producing the particular kind of moisture that accompanies actual cardiac events. I had performed initial assessment on hundreds of people experiencing actual cardiac events. I had also, over the course of 30 years, watched my mother perform this gesture at the conclusion of every serious argument she had been in danger of losing. I did not move toward her. I did not call for anyone to bring water or clear a path. I stood where I was, hands resting loosely at my sides, and I let the 2 pages on the table continue their work. My mother's sister had arrived at the edge of the table. She put on her reading glasses and picked up the folder from the remaining stack, and she turned to the second section, where the trust documents were organized behind the bank statements. She began to read. My mother had told the groom, at some point before the wedding, that the money was a personal gift from her own savings. He had mentioned it to me briefly in a hallway 3 weeks ago, casually, the way someone mentions a detail they expect to be uninteresting. I had smiled and said nothing. I reached into the outer pocket of my bag and removed a small white card and placed it on the table next to the receipts. The entire room exhaled the way a room exhales when it stops pretending. The card was standard size, white with blue text, the kind the hospital print shop produced in batches. He picked it up the way he had picked up the bank statement, with the careful grip of someone who understands that certain small objects carry significant weight. He read it. I watched his face complete the process of reading it, the small muscular adjustment around his eyes that occurs when information reorganizes itself. I told him that my mother had always described me to people as a nurse who worked with her hands. I said it the way I would deliver a patient status update, flat and accurate, with no particular emphasis. I said she had never mentioned the second part of the job title. He set the card down on the table. He looked at me. He looked at my mother. He looked back at me. My mother was staring at the card. Whatever expression she had been maintaining for the past 40 minutes had been replaced by something I had not seen on her face before, a quality of blankness that was not calm, but was the thing that appears after the machinery of control has stopped receiving its usual input and has not yet determined what to produce instead. She had introduced me as her daughter who worked at the hospital. She had said it at dinners and at appointments, and at the school fundraiser my son had attended, said it with a faint quality of apology in her tone, as though she were explaining something slightly unfortunate but manageable. She had said it to this room, at some point before tonight, and it had produced a specific image of me in the minds of the people currently seated around the head table. Regional Healthcare Financial Coordination Director. That was what the card said. It had said it for 3 years. She had never asked me what I did in the actual organizational structure. She had asked me what time I got off shift, and whether I could take her to her afternoon appointments, and whether the hospital had any way to reduce the outstanding balances on her medical account. The last question I had been answering through a patient hardship fund I had partial oversight of for 22 months. The total I had approved on her behalf was $38,000. My sister took a step toward the table and reached for the folder. My mother's sister placed her hand on my sister's arm, not roughly, just with a weight that stopped the reaching. My sister's arm stopped. Her crying had stopped as well. She was looking at the card in the way that people look at objects that have rearranged the structure of a situation they thought they understood. I said it without raising my voice. I said that the person my mother had described as working with her hands was also the person who had signed the approvals that kept my mother's house from being placed in collections proceedings 8 months ago. I said my mother had believed she was managing me. I said it was also possible to describe the situation in the opposite direction. A spoon fell at a table near the window. The sound it made when it hit the plate was very small and very clear. One of the groom's family members rose from her chair. The chair made a scraping sound, and she looked at my mother with an expression that contained an evaluation, an adjustment, and a conclusion, all visible in sequence. My mother reached for the groom's arm. He had already moved his arm. It was a small movement, a shift of weight that transferred his hand from the table surface to his own jacket lapel, and it was done without comment. But my mother's fingers closed on empty air and she had to lower her hand back to the table. I reached into the folder and removed the document my mother's sister had given me 3 weeks ago, a photocopy of the original trust established by my grandparents, with the relevant clause about irrevocability highlighted in yellow. I placed it on top of the other papers. I pointed to a specific paragraph with my index finger, not tapping the page, just resting my fingertip at the beginning of the relevant line. He read the clause. He read it again. I watched his head move once, a small downward nod, the kind of movement that is not agreement but recognition, the physical acknowledgement of a legal term whose implications had been immediately understood. He turned and looked at my sister with an expression I can only describe as distance, because it was the opposite of how a person looks at someone they have agreed to share a life with. My mother was no longer performing the chest pain. She was standing with her back straight and her face darkened with something that was closer to exposure than to anger. She looked at me. I looked back at her, and did not look away. She was the first to turn. He straightened his tie. He looked at the microphone on the empty platform. He inhaled once, a long, controlled breath, and then he walked toward the platform steps. He walked up the steps to the platform with the gait of a man who has mentally transferred himself from one professional role into another. The champagne glass was still on the lectern where my sister had left it. He moved it to one side with 2 fingers, touched the microphone, and waited for the room to complete its process of recognizing that the situation had changed. My mother pushed herself up from the table. Her hands went flat on the linen and she used the surface the way you use a wall when you need support, you would rather not need, and she stood. She said that he should stop. She said it at a volume designed for the room rather than for him specifically, a broadcast rather than a conversation. She said this was a family matter and that the people present did not need to be involved in it. He looked at her from the platform and said nothing. I reached into the deepest section of the folder and removed the final document. It had been prepared by the law office whose address appeared in the top right corner, and it was sealed with a red wax impression that had hardened perfectly flat during the 2 days it had been in my bag. I set it on the table and drew it slowly through the spilled champagne pooling at the edge of the tablecloth, since my mother had knocked a glass when she stood. I positioned it in front of where he would stand when he returned. My mother slammed her hand on the table. The remaining glassware shifted. One champagne flute tilted and came to rest against a bread plate with a sound like a small bell. She said something that the microphone would not have needed to amplify, because she was no longer managing her volume. She said she had given birth to me. She said she had the right to use whatever I earned. She called me ungrateful. She said I was destroying my sister on her wedding day. I looked at her. I did not change my expression. I noted the silk handkerchief crumpled in her fist, the structure of it visible through the lace glove because she was gripping it with the full force of both hands. I noted the silver threads of her hair that had come free from the arrangement she had spent a long time creating that morning. I noted that the guests near the window had begun to stand and move toward the exit in the careful, unhurried manner of people who wish to leave without being observed leaving. My sister attempted to reach the folder. She stood and leaned across the table, and her fingers made contact with the cover, and my mother's sister stepped forward and placed both hands firmly on my sister's shoulders, and my sister made a sound, a high, wordless sound, and collapsed back into her chair. She grabbed the pearls at her throat with both hands. The Tiffany clasp was a small gold mechanism at the back of her neck, and the way she was pulling forward on the strand put tension on it. My mother tried the chest pain again. She lowered herself into her chair and pressed her palm below her collarbone and let her breathing become audible. I observed the rhythm of her chest through the fabric of her dress. Consistent, bilateral, unlabored beneath the performance. The color in her face was not changing. I was the person in the room with the most training and the most direct experience in distinguishing the real version of this event from the performed version, and I had been able to make that distinction for the last 14 years. Nobody moved toward her. Not one person in the ballroom moved to assist her. The guests who remained watched with the particular stillness of people who have been given enough context to understand what they are seeing. I took out my phone. I opened the banking application notification I had received at 6:47 that morning, a fraud alert from the institution that managed the trust, confirming that the attempted transfer my mother had believed I had authorized was flagged and frozen pending investigation. I placed the phone screen up on the table and positioned it so that he could see the notification clearly from the platform. He looked at the screen. He looked at the wedding ring on his hand. He removed it with 2 fingers and set it on the table beside the Tiffany receipt. The metal made a sound when it hit the marble inlay, a short, dry sound that had no echo. He walked off the platform through the side door, and he did not come back through it. The guests at the head table followed in a sequence that unfolded over the next 3 minutes with a terrible and entirely predictable logic. My mother and my sister were left at the table with the overturned glassware and the spread of papers and the ring. I lifted my son from his chair, settled his weight against my shoulder, and felt the slight tightening of his arms around my neck that meant he was tired. I held the folder under my other arm and I turned toward the hallway door. I knew she would follow me before I heard the sound of her chair. The hallway carpet was a different texture from the ballroom floor, and my heels went quiet on it. And the sound from behind me was the sound of a room that had stopped being a wedding and become something else. The kind of noise that has no specific source because it is composed of many small sounds all occurring simultaneously. My mother's sister walked beside me. She had not spoken since the ballroom. She was holding the original trust document against her chest with one arm, and with her free hand, she reached up and pressed her palm briefly onto my shoulder. A single press. Not a squeeze. More like a placement. Like setting something down carefully. He was at the front desk. He had his phone to his ear and was speaking in the flat, precise manner of someone conducting professional communication rather than personal conversation. I could hear enough to understand that he was requesting a halt to the ceremony registration and a freeze on all outstanding vendor payments connected to the event booking. He spoke with the measured cadence of someone who has had to explain complicated things to people over a phone line before and knows exactly how to do it efficiently. Through the gap of the ballroom door, I watched the hotel manager approach the head table. He was carrying a printed notice, and I watched my mother's face change color as she read the first line. The black card she had presented at the hotel's business center that morning to confirm the booking was the card on my account. The one I had allowed her to use for hotel-related expenses 18 months ago when she told me she needed a card with a higher limit for travel purposes. She had used it since then for 43 separate transactions I had documented over the course of 4 months. The hotel had received instructions from my account's fraud protection service at 8:15 that morning. My sister sat on the ballroom floor. Not in a chair, on the floor, with her knees drawn up and both hands pressed against the pearls at her throat. The dress was not designed for sitting on floors. The fabric pulled across her knees and a seam at the bottom of the skirt had split, and the pale lining showed through the opening. She was staring at the Tiffany receipt still lying flat on the table above her. The diamonds continued to catch the chandelier light and break it into small spectral points, the way diamonds do regardless of context, regardless of what has happened in the room around them. I adjusted my son's position against my shoulder. He was heavier when he was tired, the particular heaviness of a child who has stopped actively participating in being carried and is simply allowing it. I pulled his jacket closed over his chest and held it there with one hand. The consequence for my mother arrived in a specific order. First the card, then the civil complaint notification that my mother's sister had handed to the security officer, who was now required by the hotel's protocol to serve it on the premises, which he did by walking to the head table and placing it near my mother's hand, with a formality that the situation did not permit her to argue with. Then the calls she made, reaching out to whoever she was reaching, and the series of unanswered rings that I watched her phone produce each time, visible through the gap in the door because she was holding the phone out in front of her face, and the screen showed the status of each call. Nothing connected. He came back through the ballroom side door. He moved through it with a direction and efficiency that were different from every way he had moved before. And he walked to the table only long enough to tell the staff to collect the gift table items and hold them for legal review. My sister grabbed at his jacket. He removed her hand from the fabric with a gesture that was not aggressive, but was definitive, the kind of physical boundary that someone sets when they have decided they are not available for the thing being requested. He looked at her once, and the look contained recognition, the particular recognition of someone who has just understood the structure of a situation they had been inside of without fully seeing. Then he walked out the main door. She screamed after him. The sound was raw and formless, entirely unlike the measured musical quality she had been using at the microphone 40 minutes ago. It traveled through the gap in the door and down the hallway clearly. He stopped near me at the end of the hallway. He stood at a distance that communicated a recognition of having contributed, however passively, to a situation. He said he had heard everything. He said he could not understand how he had nearly entered a legal partnership with people who had taken money from a child. He said my name, and he said he was sorry for believing what he had been told about me. I nodded once. I did not extend my hand. I did not move toward him or away from him. I stood with my son's weight against my shoulder, and I accepted the apology with the plainness it deserved, which was acknowledgement without expansion, because I was not looking for anything from him, and the apology was complete as it was. He looked at my son for a moment, and then he turned and walked toward the elevator bank. My mother's sister had gone ahead to bring the car from the garage level. The hallway was quiet in the way that hotel hallways are quiet at the end of an event, a specific kind of quiet that comes when the noise source has been removed and the space has not yet returned to its neutral state. I checked the last button on my son's jacket and felt the clasp click securely. There was no exhilaration. There was something else. Something cleaner and more functional. A quality of lightness that felt structural rather than emotional. The sensation of a load having been removed from a surface that had been bearing it for a very long time. The number was 5 years. That was the duration. I did not review it. I simply noted that it was over. I heard her before I saw her. The sound of uneven footsteps moving fast on the hallway carpet, the catch of breath that accompanies running in formal shoes, and beneath both of those sounds, the specific pull and drag of fabric that has been torn and is now catching on the floor. I stopped walking before she called my name. I heard the footsteps, and I stopped, and I did not turn around. I stood in front of the revolving door that led out to Madison Avenue, and I held my son's weight against me, and I breathed once, slowly, taking in the last of the air-conditioned interior air of the Carlisle with its lily and champagne and expensive upholstery smell, because I knew this was the last conversation, and I wanted the breath before it to be deliberate. She called my name. The sound of it carried down the marble and carpet length of the lobby hallway, the word pitched high and open the way a voice goes when the person producing it has stopped considering how they sound. She told me to stop. She said I could not leave her like this. She caught up to me. Her hands had lost the lace gloves at some point, and the fingers that closed around my arm were bare, the nails freshly done in a pale pink that had been chosen for today. And the grip was harder than she would have allowed herself to use in any room where people could evaluate her. She was not crying. Her eyes were very wide, and the expression in them was something I can only describe accurately as shock at having arrived at a place she had always believed she could prevent through management. She had been managing me for 36 years. She had believed the management to be permanent. She told me that if I walked out through that door, I was no longer her daughter. She said it with a flatness designed to make the statement sound like a fact rather than a threat. The same technique she had used when she told me I was a surplus. The same technique she had used in the hospital corridor with the billing statements. She said I would be alone. She said there would be no one to help me when my son needed something I could not provide on my own. She asked if I understood what I was doing. My sister stood at the far end of the hallway in the ruined dress and did not move forward. She looked at me with an expression that had resolved itself into the simple, functional hatred of someone who has been deprived of something they had come to regard as guaranteed income. She was not crying either. The performance had ended when the audience left. My mother shifted tactics. She mentioned my father, who had been dead for 11 years. She mentioned the years she had spent raising me, using the word sacrifice with the same tone she used when she wanted the word to function as a debt instrument. She mentioned things she had done when I was too young to have any memory of them, things that could not be verified, things that existed only in the version of the past she had constructed and maintained. Her voice had taken on a tight, compressed quality, like air escaping through a small opening, and her grip on my arm had not loosened. I looked at the space between her fingers on my arm. I reached up with my free hand and I removed her fingers one at a time, starting with the smallest, applying steady outward pressure until the grip released, the same way you remove the hand of a patient in the recovery room who is closed around something they cannot let go of in the confusion of coming back to themselves. I held her hand for 1 second after I had released it from my arm, and then I let it go. I looked at her. She looked back at me. Her face was doing several things at once, cycling through the available options, waiting for me to flinch or soften or offer a version of the situation she could work with. I did not offer any of those things. I said it quietly, without variation in my tone from the beginning of the sentence to the end. I said she had never raised me with love. I said she had raised me with invoices. And I said that tonight I had paid the last one. Her mouth stopped moving. Her arm dropped. I turned around. The revolving door was heavy, and I pushed it with one arm while holding my son with the other, and the resistance of it was satisfying in the specific way that physical work is satisfying, when it is also a conclusion. The cold air of the street came in before I had finished moving through the door, hitting the side of my face first and then spreading across my shoulders and down through the fabric of my dress to the skin underneath. It was the kind of cold that is also clean, the kind that takes things off rather than adding them. My son pulled his face closer to my neck. I stood at the top of the stone steps. The traffic on Madison Avenue was continuous and indifferent and functional, moving at the pace that New York traffic moves at this hour, and the sound of it was different from every sound that had been produced inside that building tonight. I did not look back through the glass at my mother. I did not look for my sister. I looked at the car waiting at the curb, and I walked down the steps. My mother's sister had the engine running. I opened the back door and settled my son into his seat and buckled the harness, checking each clip the way I always checked each clip, pressing the release button to confirm the mechanism was engaged, and then pulling the strap to confirm the tension. I closed the door. I sat in the front seat. The car smelled like old leather and the particular faint presence of the lavender she kept in the glove compartment. She looked at me once in the rearview mirror, and then she looked at the road, and she pulled away from the curb. If there is something true that you have been holding back, Something you have never said to the person who expected you to absorb every consequence of their choices and remain grateful for the opportunity. Write it in the comments. Not for me. You do not owe me anything. Write it because it exists, and it has been sitting inside you and it belongs somewhere outside of you. I will read every one of them. And if this story found you at a moment when you needed to hear that choosing yourself is not the same as doing something wrong, stay close. There are more stories to tell. The shouting from inside the hotel was behind the glass now, behind the stone, behind the distance that the car was already creating between that building and wherever we were going next. My son's breathing was steady in the back seat. The city moved around us, continuous and lit, and entirely unconcerned with what had just ended. Freedom is not warm. It is not the feeling of winning. It is the absence of the weight, and the quiet after, and the knowledge that the quiet is yours to keep. That is enough. That is exactly enough.